And it's a real pleasure to be here and to address you today and to bring you up to date on what we are doing on climate change, what we are negotiating, how we are preparing for the next round of the climate negotiations, and also what our view is on the finance related to climate change and in particular to the GCCA. So I would like to leave some time also for questions and answers that you may have. I would like to focus my talk on 5 points: on what we currently do inside the EU, on how we prepare for the next negotiation round in Doha. Then the third point is on the Adaptation Framework. That is a very important point on the table also in Doha. Then on the climate finance and the Green Climate Fund. And then finally to come to some points I would like to make related to the GCCA. So first on what we are doing in the EU, I think you all know that climate change is very high on the agenda of the EU, and the most important test of credibility is what we currently are doing to bring down emissions. And you know, we signed up and we ratified and we implemented fully the Kyoto Protocol. The delivery date is this year, end of this year, on which we, I think, can have our heads up. We promised and we delivered on all promises included in the Kyoto Protocol first commitment period. We promised to bring down our emissions by 8%. We also took a number of other commitments, also related to finance, and I think that that is a very important element, and I understand for that reason that the international community is insisting for the EU to continue and to take on a second commitment period. Now, how were we bringing down emissions? We have a number of flagship initiatives, and I would like to draw your attention to 3-4 of them. First, we have the ETS, the Emissions Trading Scheme. That is the scheme that applies to all energy-intensive activities. That means the power sector, steel, cement, etc. And that has been the main engine to bring down greenhouse gas emissions in Europe and continues to do that. And so ETS, of course, we have to maintain that instrument on a daily basis. You know that the prices currently are relatively low because of a number of reasons, and we can go into that. But we are taking policy action to redress that situation. Another star measure has been our regulation related to cars. You may know that the car standards, as far as energy efficiency and carbon emissions is concerned, are the most stringent in the world, and we just made a proposal to bring them down even further, which brings down our car standards as the most ambitious in the view of 2020, which means 95 grams per kilometer, which is more or less, in popular words, generalizing the 3-liter car. And that was not an easy go with our car industry, in particular in the current economic circumstances we are in. And the third element I would like to draw your attention to is renewables. We have a target for 2020 where 20% of the energy consumed in Europe is going to be produced by renewable energy. That means 1 kilowatt hour in 3 will be produced through renewable energy. And also that, I think, has been a challenging target, but we are on track to deliver that as well. And for those who have read this morning the newspapers, you know that last night on energy efficiency, we knocked off a very fundamental piece of legislation on energy efficiency. The European Parliament was giving its final word and okay last night, and I think that on energy efficiency, that is going to become an increasing source of cutting carbon emissions. So just to sketch you out that an enormous part of our work is to deliver on the essential of the Kyoto Protocol, which is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Let me then turn to the second point, which is the flip side of what we are doing inside Europe. What is on the negotiation table? And you know that every year we have a conference of the parties. That is always late November, beginning December. And this year, that conference of the parties is going to take place in Doha. And we just had a negotiation session in Bangkok, and we will have another one in Seoul. And I think that we are about to make another step compared to where we left it in Durban last year. And what was the importance of Durban? In Durban, we got a balanced outcome. That means that for the EU and for the Kyoto parties, we in the EU signed up to the second commitment period. And that has been an important decision which was not easily taken inside Europe. I know that in the world we are the strong defenders of the Kyoto Protocol, and we remain strong defenders of the Kyoto Protocol, but at the same time one has to realize that due to the economic changes in the world and due to our carbon reduction program, the emissions of the EU today as part of global emissions has gone down to 11%. So at the time when we signed up to Kyoto, it was something like 20%. Today it's only 11%. And so even with the best will and even with our unilateral commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 20% in 2020, we will not be able to control climate change, because we need other players in the world to take equal commitments. And with the other players, we primarily target, of course, the United States, and we also target the emerging economies. We have a very intensive debate with the basic countries, China, India, Brazil and South Africa, who are teaming up in the negotiations. And we make it a very important point that Europe can only continue to go forward, provided the major emitters that have been coming up as important new emitters since the signing of the Climate Convention and the Kyoto Protocol also have to take emission reduction commitments. And that was the balanced outcome of Durban. We in the EU, we promised to continue with Kyoto and the second commitment period. And at the same time, there was a strong commitment taken that by 2015, a new climate agreement will be signed in which all major emitters are represented. And that new agreement would be applicable as of 2020. And that is known as the Durban Platform, and the discussions are currently shaping up around the ADP, the platform related to Durban. And that is now what is very much on our table for Doha. This result needs not only to be confirmed, but first steps in operationalizing the path towards that big major agreement for 2015 needs to be elaborated. And I think that that is an important element for the work we are all doing, because the world has changed so much compared to the early 1990s in terms of countries coming up and rapidly industrializing. And so the split that is currently present in the Climate Convention and the Kyoto Protocol, which means on the one hand you have developing countries and on the other hand you have developed countries, is something that we will have to qualify. Because we do not dispute the importance of the group and the reasons and the argumentations of the group of developing countries, but at the same time one has to realize that in the group of developing countries there are quite a number of countries who are much richer compared to many of the member states of the EU, to take that as an example. When I compare the income per capita of countries like Singapore or the Middle East countries or Chile or Mexico or Korea, then that is just an example of how much the world has changed compared to when we were in the beginning of the 1990s. So how strongly we are committed to the important principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, how strongly we are also motivated to reinterpret this important principle taking into account the important economic changes that have taken place in the world. Just to give you another example, you know, when we signed the Climate Convention and Kyoto Protocol in the early 1990s, the emissions per capita of China was only a fraction of the emissions per capita of the European Union. Today, the emissions per capita of China equals the emissions per capita of the European Union. So that is an important change, and we will not be able to cope with climate change if all major emitters are not going to be able to bring down their greenhouse gas emissions. So that's the big picture, and you will understand that that is not an easy picture to negotiate about, because some would say the signposts of the past are being changed. We are very adamant we are not changing the signposts, but we have to adapt the international negotiations to the new realities that are there in the world. And so we started that process in Durban, and in that wider picture, the next rendezvous in Doha is going to be of absolute importance. So that is for my second point, the international negotiations, not easy, but a strong commitment to prepare the new international agreement and a strong commitment for the EU already to sign up today to the second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol. Then I would like to have a few words on it, and the third point on the adaptation framework, because adaptation is a very important element, because we know that the poorest communities and the real developing countries face up to a tremendous reality of adapting to climate change. So while we have in the EU also a debate on adaptation, because here the glaciers are melting, the sea level is rising, and we see that already. And we have, besides the adaptation debate, an important mitigation debate. We, I think, are confronted with an increasing realization that, in particular for poor countries and developing countries, it is an uphill battle to adapt to climate change. And so we are focusing our debates and our attention and aid very much on the least developing countries and the small island development states, the SIDS, because they are really facing an extraordinary challenge related to climate change. Now in Doha, and that will be the subject of a debate, because we think and we hope that in Doha, and with your support, we hope that we will have an agreement in Doha on how to develop national adaptation plans. The modalities, the guidelines, etc. of the national adaptation plans still need to be made. And these national adaptation plans are important for several reasons, because we have to look at adaptation as a programmatic issue, as a long-term issue, as a development issue. So adaptation efforts need to be integrated in the policy plans of the states concerned. And we want to move away from piecemeal action, all too isolated action, more towards a comprehensive policy approach related to adaptation to climate change. And we are strongly believing that once we have an agreement on the national adaptation plans, and when developing countries and SIDS and all those countries facing up to adaptation are coming forward with their national adaptation plans, that will facilitate tremendously the debate to argue in favor of financial support in one or the other area. And so on the national adaptation plans, I think that is a very, very critical point where we should be able in Doha to come to an agreement on how they would look like, how they should look like. And it's not only of importance to the EU, but I'm also thinking on the financial sector, the World Bank and all its daughters, that is a need as well of a more programmatic approach. So on Doha, and in particular where we could join up together, is on having our minds focused on the guidelines, modalities of the national adaptation plans. Which brings me to the fourth point. You may ask yourself, some 2-3 years ago, at one of the COPs that was not particularly a success in Copenhagen, an important pledge was made. A pledge was made that by 2020, the world would bring together $100 billion as a form of aid to adapt and to mitigate climate change. And we are standing still, even with the economic difficulties we face today, with that overall objective. But of course, it's not only Europe who can bring aboard this quite important amount of money. So we have to start operationalizing that process. And one of the other elements that is on the table, that was on the table in Durban, that will be on the table on Doha, is the Green Climate Fund. And the Green Climate Fund is a new institution that is being created to operationalize the aid related to the 100 billion. Now, I have to qualify the 100 billion is not only going to be funded through sources of public finance, because also the private sector and the carbon market is going to play its role into that. But it will be to the Green Climate Fund to elaborate a precise timeline between now and 2020 and to tell us and guide us to what extent the multilateral financial institutions can be used and can be used in a way so as to deliver the $100 billion. Because you may remember that also in Copenhagen, a pledge was made on fast start finance. So there were two pledges. There was the figure of 100 billion for 2020, but also a figure on fast start finance, which would cover 3 periods, 3 years, the year 2010, 11 and 12. And now that third year now comes to an end. And I'm pleased to tell you that the EU has been sticking to its promise despite serious financial trouble of bringing this fast start finance on the table, and the last piece of information is being prepared to bring on the table of Doha. And then let me conclude with a few words on the GCCA. I think that prioritizing adaptation in the context of the GCCA and adaptation to the most vulnerable countries is a very, very important objective. The least developed countries, the small island development states, I think are very much in the focus of the GCCA. And another important element where the GCCA could play a function towards venturing some new ways that can be important for and informative for the establishment of the Green Climate Fund and its operations is how we can combine different sources of money, how we can leverage different sources of money and finance from the public and the private sector, as well as from the carbon market. And that can happen in many different ways. That can happen as part of the RED+, that can happen as part of the CDM, that can happen as part of strengthening the planning capacities and capabilities, that can happen in the form of strengthening reporting and monitoring requirements that in any case are going to be related to this money. Because I think that one element that I see emerging in the context of climate finance is a strong insistence on delivery. And delivery will have to be proven. And hence the importance of reporting and monitoring, because convincing those to bring the money on the table is only going to happen if, as part of that convincing argument, is going to be that either adaptation to climate change is happening or emissions are going to be brought down. And I think that the monitoring and the reporting is for that reason going to be very important. Of course, climate-related natural disasters are also, and the cluster around that, how can we reduce the risk, how can we limit the impacts of natural disasters, how can we improve our forest management and things like that, are all things which are of absolute importance. So the GCCA, the Fast Start financing and the Green Climate Fund are a nexus of three important elements that are going to grow in importance. But there is one thing that is still on our table in the EU, and that is that as we speak, and in the coming 6 months, we will have a quite intensive political debate between the Member States, the European institutions, the European Parliament, about how to make a decision on the finance of the EU between now and 2020. In our jargon, the MFF, the Multilateral Financial Framework. And we are very committed in the Commission to foresee sufficient and adequate resources for the sake of climate change. Overall, the Commission decided that 20% of the future community budget should be climate related, directly or indirectly, for international and for domestic purposes. But that's an important step. That would mean a quadrupling of the resources available for climate compared to what we were doing in the past. But there will be a very important element, is how we can use this money that in any case is going to be available in more limited amounts that we all would hope for, how we can leverage other financial resources, how we can cluster financial resources from the EU, from different member states of the EU, from different parts of the world, from the financial sector, from the carbon market. I think clustering is going to be of absolute importance, and for a good cluster to bring up the money, you need a good program, you need a good plan, and for that reason I cannot underline strong enough how important in Doha it would be to agree on a national adaptation plan, how to make it, what the constraints and what are the essential elements are going to be. And in that sense, the Doha round is going to be of absolute importance. So I hope to meet with you and with many of you in Doha end of November, first week of December. Thank you very much.